Just want to introduce myself. I'm Matt Yost. I work with Utah State University Extension. I am an agroclimate extension specialist. Been there for about 3 years working at Utah State. I think I've met many of you, but some I have not. So nice to meet you. Thank you for coming today. Here's Tony Richards. I think most of you know Tony. Tony and I got together months ago and talked along with Beer Thopper with the NRCS and talked about the idea of having this group get together. UDAF, NRCS, Extension, the conservation districts. We thought it'd be great to come together and discuss soil health and discuss water conservation. These are pretty hot topics, not only in Utah but across the country. So there's a lot of excitement, a lot of interest in it, as evidenced with the workshops that have been held the last few years. Lots of interest from growers in these kinds of things. So we thought it'd be really great to come together, share some research, some experience with different aspects of soil health and water conservation, and then have some discussions. So at the end of our program tomorrow, we've scheduled time for us just to sit around and think about what we've discussed during this meeting, and then talk about ideas and priorities, and make plans for how we can help advance soil and water conservation in the state. Tony, anything else you want to?
Just make sure for this specific, Extension and SARE help fund this. So what we need to have is come check in with me if you haven't checked in already. And then secondly, if you see Marion Murray sometime in the next day or whatever, thank Matt, because if we wouldn't be able to do this. We've held Keith Burns over to come and share some more information one-on-one. Our hope is to give you guys tools, to give you some things to think on, and help our ag producers in this area, okay? We are the on-the-ground guys. We are the ones that deal with them closely. And so we want to be able to give you guys what you need to be able to do that. So again, like I said, make sure we thank Matt and Marion in person for putting that together. So.
Very good. Very good. This lapel one's not quite as good, but I'll try. Does that work okay? Good sound, good volume? Okay. Well, thank you. You have the agenda. I don't. But you'll see there that we have three presentations to kickstart us here that focus on water conservation. So we're going to try to cover a lot the next day. We're going to spend a little bit of time on water conservation and more time on soil conservation, soil health. So we'll start with just a few presentations on water conservation. We'll have a break, and then we'll have 3 more presentations on monitoring soil health. And then tomorrow we'll get into several different sections on different principles of soil health. So let's get started. I would love to introduce our first speaker, but he is not here. And he called me 3 or 4 hours ago and said his truck had broken down about near Nephi. Maybe somebody passed him. Mark, did you pass him on the way? But he grabbed a car and he's supposedly on his way. So I prepared basically his presentation if I need to give it, but I'm going to wait and I'm going to give mine first. And then we're going to circle back, and if he doesn't show up, I'll give his. So that's what we'll try. So I'm going to have to skip around this presentation just a little bit. Just to forewarn you, I do not have a laser pointer. They don't show up on LCD screens, so I'm not going to be able to point to anything. So I'll try to work with that and try to just kind of point you to the area and the direction to look at. So today, to kickstart us, I'm going to talk about water optimization. Different ways, different methods we can use to try to optimize our water use in Utah. When you think about water optimization, it's a complicated story. If you think soil conservation's hard, start working on water conservation. It's a challenge. It's a really complicated system. There's lots of, the water cycle's complicated, and it's hard to figure out ways to optimize it. You change one thing and you affect something else downstream. So it's a complicated story, but when I think about water optimization, I like to think about three areas. One is how we manage the water. A second is how we manage the crop. And third, related to that, is how we manage the soil. And so there's combinations of all three of those things and lots of different options that can all come together to help us figure out how to optimize water use in agriculture. So it's really complicated, but today we're just going to talk about water management. First, Earl's going to tell us a little bit about crop and soil management. So there's three areas here, and the first one is what Neil was going to talk about. So I'm going to skip that. We'll come back to it later if Neil doesn't show up. So the second item on here is the one that I want to spend the most time on, and that's irrigation scheduling. So let's just skip through. Okay, so irrigation scheduling. How do most farmers schedule their irrigation in Utah? What's that? On their irrigation turn? Yeah? Whenever they feel like it. Okay? When crops are stressed. That's a good answer. Yeah. Any other ideas? Maybe when the neighbor turns the water on? Yeah. Yeah, there's some real restrictions. If you're on a turn, a farmer's on a turn, they sometimes have no ability to change their schedule. But almost every farmer can change their rate, right? They can adjust how much they put on with some restrictions. So there's limitations, right? This is data from NASS. They do an irrigation survey as a part of the census, and they actually ask this question, how do you irrigate? And this is the data. It's from Utah, but it also includes 3 or 4 other surrounding states. The number one way that farmers indicated they schedule their irrigation was by watching the crop. Way to go, Ryan, way to go. That was the number one indicator that farmers use is the crop. Anyone see any problems with that? It's too late. Yeah. Yeah, very good. If you see corn that looks like this, what's wrong? You've already lost yield, right? You've already lost yield potential. And a lot of times there's no way to come back from it. You can dump the water on and you've already lost yield. It's not coming back. So yes, that's one major reason why we think about other approaches. And there's lots of approaches. And we're not going to talk about all of them today, but we're going to talk about 3. Okay, so we need to do it because we need an earlier indicator, right? The crop is often too late. Once we see stress, yield is gone. It's going out the window. And so if we have an early indicator, it's going to help us get water on when we need it and avoid that stress. And really we want to avoid situations like this, right? Where we have stressed crops and we're already losing yields. Okay, so we're going to go through 3 different ways to schedule irrigation. And I know you're probably familiar with some of these, but I think there's real value in talking about them and how they work and more details on them. So the first, we're going to start with the least expensive option. And this is a free option. There's programs out there that take weather data. They take evapotranspiration estimates from weather stations, and we can use that to estimate the need for water for crops. And so one of these programs is called Irrigation Scheduler, just by raise of hands. Who's familiar with this? Just a handful of people. So free application, Washington State University developed this. You can go online, you can go on your phone, you can download it for free. Basically what you do is you go into this program, you help a farmer go into it, you enter the field, you select the weather station that's closest to your field. If you're in Utah, there's not very many farmers that don't have a weather station pretty darn close to their fields. We've got a really impressive network. So you go and you select your weather station, and you tell it your soil type, and then all that you have to do, all the farmer would have to do, is to go in and tell this program every time they irrigate and how much they irrigate. So really simple. How much and when you irrigate, And then basically what it's doing is just creating these little tables that add up the evapotranspiration from day to day. So if it's a quarter of an inch each day or so, it will just add those up. It'll take what you input as, or the farmer inputs as his irrigation rate, and then you can find these little tables there, little dashboards that will kind of show how full the profile is and how much water you need to put on to fill the deficit. So really simple, easy tool for scheduling irrigation. Okay, a second option starts to get a little more expensive. This is one of many commercial products. Some of you are probably familiar with some of the commercial products out there. The pivot manufacturers are starting to get into this business. And this is one option. So Zematic Pivots, Lindsay Corporation, they've developed a program they called FieldNet Advisor. And other companies are doing similar things. And basically what they do is they take models. So they take satellite data, they take weather data from huge, large networks, and free soil data, and they put those, and crop growth models. They put those things together to try to estimate water need across the field. The neat thing is that then your irrigation scheduling becomes automated. Basically, at any point during the season, the pivot's estimating water need at every sector in that field, and it can, if you want it to, it'll adjust and irrigate according to what the models predict it should need. So, really great option if you want to automate, or a farmer wants to automate their irrigation. It does cost, it's about $450 per field per year. So if you're doing that on your whole farm, that adds up over time. But a great way to automate your irrigation. Okay, number 3, which we're going to spend the most time talking about, soil sensors. We know there's a lot of soil sensors out there. Some of us probably have experience with some of them. And it becomes difficult to know which one works, if they work, which one we should use, which one we should recommend to a farmer. So there's lots of options. So I want to walk through that today. So there's 3, Neil, welcome. You made it. So three things you need to know about soil sensors, 3 components. So number 1, you've got the sensor, right? There's lots of different types of these. Number 2, you have a logger, some kind of logger, some way to collect the soil sensor data, soil moisture data, and get it, either send it to the internet or allow you to access it. So the third component then is telemetry. And this is becoming much more popular. Almost all of the sensor manufacturers are moving this direction. They want to get the information off the logger to the internet so that you can access it from your phone or your computer. So those are the 3 major parts of almost all soil moisture sensing systems. Okay, so the question becomes which one to use, which one to recommend to a farmer. This is a hard question. I think that one of the first things you should consider is how you're going to access the data. If farmers are willing to go out and push a button to get their reading of soil moisture or soil water potential, great. It's going to be a cheaper option. If they're not willing to do that and they need it on their phone or their computer, then it's going to cost more, and you're going to need a telemetry system. Okay? Also, you need to consider the total cost of the ownership and the return on investment for those sensors. No reason to stick it out in your field if it's not going to return anything, and if it's going to cost more than the benefits. The other key question is how many do you need? How many do you need in a field? This is a hard question. I think the key variable here is how much variability you have. If you've got a field that has essentially no variation or little variation, 1 sensor is probably fine. If you've got a ton of variation in your field, then you're going to want more soil sensors. The other key factor about this is put as many soil sensors out in a field as you're willing to adjust, as many as you're willing to adjust your irrigation. So if a farmer is not willing to adjust their irrigation across the field, don't put more than 1 sensor, It's of no benefit. You could have two sensors saying different things. If they don't change their irrigation, it makes no sense to do that. So use that as a guide on how many you should put in. Okay, so there's lots of options for soil moisture sensors. It's hard to know which one. Cost is a huge factor. And so what I've done here is try to just compare costs for several different types of sensors. It's really hard to do this, to compare apples to apples, because there's lots of different options and different methods and different setup and equipment. So I did my best. So what I did is I selected just a center pivot, 120 acres. I picked 2 or 4 field locations kind of based on the type of soil moisture sensor. I estimated the cost over 10 years to own that system. I included remote access on a lot of these. And then we were looking at just the top, monitoring moisture in just the top 3 feet of soil. Okay, so when we do this, I just picked, I've got 7 options there. These are soil moisture sensors that we use quite a bit for research, and I think there's some good applications for farmers. So if you look at those 7 options, you'll see that it's quite expensive, right? It's thousands of dollars to put a soil moisture sensor in. You'll also see that the telemetry is a huge cost, right? If they need that data remotely, it's going to add a lot to the cost. But it also adds to the benefit for convenience and actually using that soil moisture sensor. So that's what it looks like. I think what's helps make this more digestible is if you look at the cost over time and over acres. So if you do that, if you take that cost and you split it up over that 120 acres across the pivot, and you spread that cost out over 10 years, which is about how long a lot of these systems will last, the cost becomes a lot more digestible, right? Anywhere from $2 up to $5, $6, $7 an acre per year to monitor soil moisture. And I know some farmers will really have heartburn over this, but I like to stress that, hey, what input do we put on our crops that doesn't cost that much? A single tillage pass usually costs more than that in fuel and time, and most of our other inputs cost more. So it really, when you think about it in that aspect, it becomes a lot more affordable for farmers to start thinking about monitoring soil moisture. I do always like to say that you should add cost for installation and maintenance. Inevitably, somebody's always going to hit one of those moisture monitors with the swather. It just happens. So they do cost a little bit more. So if farmers are investing in this, they really have to make sure that there's a return, right? That they get some value out of using the soil moisture sensor. That could be savings in water or increased yield. And so I just did some rough calculations to say, okay, if they spent $5 to $6 per acre per year on a soil moisture monitoring system, they would need to see about 1/10 of a ton increase in alfalfa yield or a 1/2 ton increase in corn silage yield, which is not that much, right? We could achieve that if in the right scenarios. So just something to keep in mind that's kind of the yield benefits we're talking about to pay for a soil moisture monitoring system. The last thing I like to suggest here is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, do not recommend a soil moisture sensor for a farmer if they have no intention of using it. It does no good. It's a waste of money to put it out there, monitor soil moisture, and if they're not willing to change their irrigation to follow that soil moisture monitor, it's a bust. It's a waste. So make sure that they're willing to use that. I'm going to skip through this for sake of time and jump to some research that we've done recently. So I've just told you about 3 approaches to irrigation scheduling. We talked about ET models, we talked about the commercial model, and we talked about soil moisture sensors. So these have been around for a long time, most of them, but we have very little research or information to say, do these really work? Do they save water? Do they impact yield? So we tried to test that. So in 2019, we set up some trials in 12 fields. in south central Utah. And on these 12 fields, we tested those 3 approaches to irrigation scheduling, and we compared it to what the farmers were currently doing. And most of them were just irrigating based on a schedule they set years ago. So to test that, we went on to 12 pivots. They all had alfalfa, and we created 4 small sectors in those 12 pivots where we put on different schedules of irrigation. Okay, here's what we found. So we had 15 cuts of alfalfa where we had information about irrigation scheduling. And so on those 15 cuts, 13 of them had the same yield as what the grower did. So these advanced approaches had no impact on yield. In 2 cases, so 2 cuts out of those 15, we saw a reduction in yield by using a small reduction in yield by using one of these advanced techniques. These results are early, but up front we can say we saw really small impacts on crop production by using these advanced techniques. So the second, I mentioned earlier that a soil moisture sensor is worth it if you increase yield or you save water, right? And so this is that second part. And what we've seen here is that we can actually save quite a bit of water by using these advanced approaches to scheduling. So here's, on those 15 cuts, most of them were in the second or the third cut. And what I've done is that dashed line just shows the average rates that the farmers were putting on, the average irrigation rates they put on their alfalfa. And then I've got the other 3 approaches there. And so you'll notice, first on the left there, that the soil moisture sensor was almost always recommending less irrigation than what the farmers were doing. The ET model, the irrigation scheduler, sometimes less, sometimes more. The FieldNet Advisor, the commercial product, same thing, about the same and sometimes a little bit less than what the growers were currently doing. So we can probably save some water with these advanced scheduling approaches, and we'll probably have very little impact on yield. So that's a plus. That's a good sign. So some take-home points. I do caveat those results with the fact that 2019 was a wet year. We had abnormal precip that year, last year, and so I think that kind of affected some of our results. Had we done this study in 2018, I think it would have been very different, where we had the major drought. The benefit of using these advanced scheduling approaches that we've seen so far is a reduction in irrigation, reduction in water use. So we do think we can save some water and not have large impacts on yield. So if you're in a position to recommend or advise farmers on using soil moisture sensors, it's important to remember that you should start small. Keep the things in mind that we discussed. Try it on a few of their fields. If it's working well, they're saving some water or they're increasing some yield, great. And if it's working, expand and increase the usage. But don't go out and put it on every single acre they own, and don't put it out if they're not willing to change their irrigation practices based on that soil moisture sensor or some of these other techniques. So there's lots of options, right? We've talked about just a few of them today in terms of water management. And what I think is really critical for Utah is we've got to figure out which options are best, which options we should recommend first to growers, which are most feasible, most economic. If we can't do that, then it's difficult. We really can't give great advice about how we can optimize water use. So I think that's a critical question. So I want to show you a work in progress that we've had to make some major assumptions and use limited data. But I just want to show you three critical questions that I think we need to continue to pursue. So when you compare all these options, again, it's really hard. Like I just described for soil moisture sensors, it's difficult to compare apples to apples. But I attempted here and want to show you quickly what we did. So again, I'm just assuming, let's look at one field, 100 or 120 acre field, one pivot, and we're going to look at the cost over 10 years for some different options that we could use to optimize water. Okay, so these are the options. Neil talked about some of these, and I talked about some. So one thing we can do is change the type of irrigation. We can move from flood to sprinklers, flood to subsurface drip irrigation. I hear a lot of talk about subsurface drip irrigation. So those are two options. If we already have pivots, which we have on a lot of our acres, we can make changes to other packages like LIPA, LISA, mobile drip irrigation. There's some things we can do to adjust our scheduling that I talked about earlier, using some things like ET models, commercial schedulers, soil moisture sensors. And then there's a lot of other things. And two that I threw up there that we're kind of looking at is just maintaining our sprinklers better and more frequently, and then just applying less water in general. So this is our estimated cost for all of those options. And you'll see that some are really, really expensive. This is in thousands of dollars. So the first two there, if we're switching from flood to subsurface, that's the most expensive thing we can do. Almost $154,000 to switch. That's going to be your cost over 10 years. Okay, so if you're just switching from flood to pivot, you're paying for the pivot. It's about $65,000. If you have a pivot and you're switching systems, the cost starts to go down some. If you're using mobile drip irrigation, you'll see that it costs a lot more than the other systems. If you look at the scheduling approaches, we talked about this earlier, right? Anywhere from $4,000 to $6,000 over 10 years to use those. And then some of those other options cost less. If we're just applying less water, generally it costs us nothing unless we lose yield. So I think that's one of the first critical things. And this is not perfect, it's a work in progress. But I think it's critical that we line all these up next to each other and say, what's the cost of doing these things and which one's going to be economic? The second question that I think is critical is what's the efficiency gain from using these different options? If we change from one thing to another, what kind of gains do we get in efficiency, which means water savings, right? We have to know which options save the most water. So this is the attempt to try to do that. Again, not perfect, but you'll see that the efficiencies or the savings in water range from a few percentage up to maybe the 30s. That's a lot of water. We can start to save that much. So some of these are based on research that we just didn't have time to share. Neil talked about some of the pivot irrigation work that we've done. On most of that pivot irrigation work, what we're finding is that LIPA, LISA, and mobile drip irrigation, we can cut back our rates by about 20%. And usually it maintains yield. Sometimes it doesn't. And so that's kind of what I estimated for those, about a 20% reduction in rates or an efficiency gain with those systems. So you can kind of see those across there. And then probably the most important question, the most important thing we should be thinking about is the cost per gain in efficiency for all of these options. And if you do that, I think that's what's going to help us target which approaches we need to be promoting that can save the most water and do it in the most economical way, the most efficient way. So this is an attempt to do that. Again, you'll see that it's costing thousands of dollars per change for each percent change in efficiency for some of those approaches, some of those systems. But you'll also see that there's some that don't cost much at all or are free. Using an irrigation scheduler program, applying less water. I didn't have time to show that research either, but we found that if we put on 10% less water on several fields in central Utah, we saw no difference in production. So there's probably some ways just to cut back a little bit on irrigation. So that's all I wanted to show you really quickly. Just we're working on this. We need to get more specific information, look at more options, but in the end, what I'd love to do is just be able to rank these things, have good resources for you as you're trying to help farmers who don't have enough water, who are trying to save water, help them know what their options are, how much it's going to cost, and what the most effective and economical approach is going to be. So with that, we'll turn the time over to Dr. Earl Creech. Earl's going to now talk about some crop and soil management that we can do to save water.